All right. The Ugly Little Boy, Isaac Asimov. Edith Fellows smoothed her working smock, as she always did, before opening the elaborately locked door and stepping across the invisible dividing line between the is and the is not. She carried her notebook and her pen, although she no longer took notes except when she felt the absolute need for some report. This time she also carried a suitcase. Games for the boys, she had said, smiling to the guard, who had long since stopped even thinking and questioning her, and who waved her on. As always, the ugly little boy knew that she had entered and came running to her, crying, "Miss Fellows! Miss Fellows!" in a soft, slurring way. "Timmy," she said, and passed her hand over the shaggy brown hair on his misshapen little head. "What's wrong?" he said. "Will Jerry be back to play again? I'm sorry about what happened." "Never mind that now, Timmy. Is that why you've been crying?" He looked away. "Not just about that, Miss Fellows. I dreamed again." "The same dream?" Miss Fellows' lips set. Of course, the Jerry affair would bring back that dream. He nodded. His two large teeth showed as he tried to smile, and the lips of his forward-thrusting mouth stretched wide. "When will I be big enough to go out there, Miss Fellows?" "Soon," she said softly, feeling her heart break. "Soon." Miss Fellows let him take her hand and enjoy the warmth and touch of the thick, dry skin of his palm. He led her through the 3 rooms that made up the whole of Stasis Section 1. Comfortable enough, yes, but an eternal prison for the ugly little boy. All of 7 years of his life? He led her to the one window, looking out into the scrubby woodland section of the world of Is, now hidden by night, where a fence and painted instruction allowed no men to wander without permission. He pressed his nose against the window. "Out there, Miss Fellows?" "Better places, nicer places," she said sadly, as she looked at his poor little imprisoned face, outlined in profile against the window. The forehead retreated flatly, and his hair lay down in tufts upon it. The back of his skull bulged and seemed to make the head over heavy, so that it sagged and bent forward, forcing the whole body into a stoop. Already bony ridges were beginning to bulge the skin above the eyes. His wide mouth thrust forward more prominently than did his wide and flattened nose, and he had no chin to speak of, only a jawbone that curved smoothly down and back. He was small for his years, and his stumpy legs were bowed. He was a very ugly little boy, and Edith Fellows loved him dearly. Her own face was behind his line of vision, so she allowed her lips the luxury of a tremor. They would not kill him. She would do anything to prevent it. Anything. She opened the suitcase and began taking out the clothes it contained. Edith Fellows had crossed the threshold of Stasis Incorporated for the first time just a little over 3 years before. She hadn't, at that time, the slightest idea as to what Stasis meant or what the place did. No one did then, except those who worked there. In fact, it was only the day after she arrived that the news broke upon the world. At the time, it was just that they had advertised for a woman with knowledge of physiology, experience with clinical chemistry, and a love for children. Edith Fellows had been a nurse in a maternity ward and believed she fulfilled those qualifications. Gerald Hoskins, whose nameplate on the desk included Ph.D. after the name, scratched his cheek with his thumb and looked at her steadily. Miss Fellows automatically stiffened and felt her face, with its slightly asymmetric nose and its a trifle too heavy eyebrows, twitch. "He's no dreamboat himself," she thought resentfully. "He's getting fat and bald, and he's got a sullen mouth." But the salary mentioned had been considerably higher than she had expected, so she waited. Hoskins says, "Now, do you really love children?" I wouldn't say I did if I didn't." "Or do you just love pretty children, nice chubby children with cute little button noses and gurgly ways?" Miss Fellows said, "Children are children, Dr. Hoskins, and the ones that aren't pretty are just the ones who may happen to need help the most." "Then suppose that we take you on." "You mean you're offering me the job now?" He smiled briefly, and for a moment his broad face had an absent-minded charm about it. He said, "I make quick decisions. So far the offer is tentative. However, I may make as quick a decision to let you go. Are you ready to take the chance? Miss Fellows clutched at her purse and calculated just as swiftly as she could, then ignored calculations and followed impulse. All right, fine. We're going to form stasis tonight, and I think you had better be there to take over at once. That will be at 8 p.m., and I'd appreciate it if you could be here at 7:30. But what? Fine. That'll be all now. On signal, a smiling secretary came in and ushered her out. Miss Fellows stared back at Dr. Hoskins' closed door for a moment. What was stasis? What had this large barn of a building with its badged employees, its makeshift corridors, and its unmistakable air of engineering to do with children? She wondered if she should go back that evening or stay away and teach that arrogant man a lesson. But she knew she would be back, if only out of sheer frustration. She would have to find out about the children. She came back at 7:30 and did not have to announce herself. One after another, men and women seemed to know her and to know her function. She could herself all but placed on skids as she was moved inward. Dr. Hoskins was there, but he only looked at her distantly and murmured, "Miss Fellows." He did not even suggest that she take a seat, but she drew one commonly up to the railing and sat down. They were on a balcony, looking down into a large pit filled with instruments that looked like a cross between the control panel of a spaceship and the working face of a computer. On one side were partitions that seemed to make up the unceilinged apartment, a giant dollhouse into the rooms of which she could look from above. She could see an electronic cooker and a free space unit in one room and a washroom arrangement off of another. And surely the object she made out in another room could only be part of a bed, a small bed. Hoskins was speaking to another man, and with Miss Fellows they made up the total occupancy of the balcony. Hoskins did not offer to introduce the other man, and Miss Fellows eyed him surreptitiously. He was thin and quite fine-looking in a middle-aged way. He had a small mustache and keen eyes that seemed to busy themselves with everything. He was saying, "I won't pretend for one moment that I understand all this, Dr. Hoskins. I mean, except as a layman, a reasonably intelligent layman may be expected to understand it. Still, if there's one part I understand less than another, it's the matter of selectivity. You can only reach out so far. That seems sensible. Things get dimmer the further that you go. It takes more energy, but then you can only reach out so near. That's the puzzling part. I can make it seem less paradoxical, Devaney, if you will allow me to use an analogy." Miss Fellows placed a new man the moment she heard his name, and despite herself was impressed. This was obviously Candid Devaney, the science writer of the Telenews, who was notoriously at the scene of every major scientific breakthrough. She even recognized his face as one she saw on the news plate when the landing on Mars had been announced. So Dr. Hoskins must have something important here. "By all means, use an analogy," said Devaney ruefully, "if you think it will help." "Well, then you can't read a book with ordinary size print if it is held 6 feet from your eyes. But you can read it if you hold it 1 foot from your eyes. So far, the closer the better. But if you bring the book to within 1 inch of your eyes, however, you've lost it again. There is such a thing as being too close, you see." Said Devaney. Or take another example. Your right shoulder is about 30 inches from the tip of your right forefinger, and you can place your right forefinger on your right shoulder. Your right elbow is only half the distance from the tip of your right forefinger. It should, by all ordinary logic, be easier to reach, and yet you cannot place your right finger on your right elbow. Again, there is such a thing as being too close. Devaney said, "May I use these analogies in my story?" "Well, of course. Only too glad. I've been waiting long enough for someone like you to have a story. I'll give you anything else you want. It is time, finally, that we want the world looking over our shoulder. They'll see something." Miss Fellows found herself admiring his calm certainty despite herself. There was strength there. Devaney said, "How far out will you reach?" 40,000 years. Miss Fellows drew in her breath sharply. Years? There was tension in the air. The men at the controls scarcely moved. One man at a microphone spoke into it in a soft monotone, in a short phrases that made no sense to Miss Fellows. Devaney, leaning over the balcony railing with an intent stare, said, "Will we see anything, Dr. Hoskins?" "What? No, nothing till the job is done." We detect indirectly something on the principle of radar, except that we use mesons rather than radiation. Mesons reach backward under the proper conditions. Some are reflected, and we must analyze the reflections. That sounds difficult. Hoskins smiled again, briefly, as always. It is the end product of 50 years of research, 40 years of it before I entered the field. Yes, it's difficult. The man at the microphone raised one hand. Hoskins said, "We've had a fix on one particular moment in time for weeks, breaking it, remaking it, after calculating our own movements in time, making certain that we could handle time flow with sufficient precision. This must work now." But his forehead glistened. Edith Fellows found herself out of her seat and at the balcony railing, but there was nothing to see. The man at the microphone said quietly, "Now." There was a space of silence, sufficient for one breath, and then the sound of a terrified little boy's scream from the dollhouse rooms. Terror, piercing terror. Miss Fellows heard her head twisted in the direction of the cry. A child was involved. She had forgotten. And Hoskins' fist pounded on the railing, and he said in a tight voice, trembling with triumph, "Did it." Miss Fellows was urged down the short spiral flight of step by the hand pressed of Hoskins' palm between her shoulder blades. He did not speak to her. The men who had been at the controls were standing about now, smiling, smoking, watching the three as they entered on the main floor. A very soft buzz sounded from the direction of the dollhouse. Hoskins said to Devaney, "It's perfectly safe to enter stasis. I've done it 1,000 times. There's a queer sensation, which is momentary and means nothing." He stepped through the open door in mute demonstration, and Devaney, smiling stiffly and drawing on an obviously deep breath, followed him. Hoskins said, "Miss Fellows, please." He crooked his forefinger impatiently. Miss Fellows nodded and stepped stiffly through. It was as if through a ripple went through her, an internal tickle. But once inside, all seemed normal. There was the smell of fresh wood of the dollhouse, and of soil somehow. There was silence now, no voice at least, but there was the dry shuffling of feet, a scrabbling as of a hand over wood, then a low moan. "Where is it?" asked Miss Fellows in distress. "Didn't these fool men care?" The boy was in the bedroom, at least in the room with the bed in it. It was standing naked, with its small dirt-smeared chest heaving raggedly. A bushel of dirt and coarse grass spread over the floor of his bare brown feet. The smell of soil came from it, and a touch of something fetid. Hoskins followed her horrified glance, and said with annoyance, "You can't pluck a boy cleanly out of time, Miss Fellows. We had to take some of the surroundings with it for safety, or would you have preferred to have it arrive here minus a leg, or with only half a head?" "Please," said Miss Fellows, in an agony of revulsion, "are we just to stand here? The poor child's frightened, and it's filthy." She was quite correct. It was smeared with encrusted dirt and grease, and had a scratch on its thigh that looked red and sore. As Hoskins approached him, the boy, who seemed to be something over 3 years in age, hunched low and backed away rapidly. He lifted his upper lip and snarled in a hissing fashion like a cat. With a rapid gesture, Hoskins seized both of the child's arms and lifted him, writhing and screaming, from the floor. Miss Fellows said, "Hold him now. He needs a warm bath first. He needs to be clean. Have you the equipment? If so, have it brought here, and I'll need to have some help handling him just at first. Then, too, for heaven's sake, have all this trash and filth removed." She was given the orders now, and she felt perfectly good about that, and because now she was an efficient nurse rather than a confused spectator, she looked at the child with a clinical eye and hesitated for one shocked moment. She saw past the dirt and shrieking, past the thrashing of limbs and useless twisting. She saw the boy himself. It was the ugliest little boy she had ever seen. It was horribly ugly, from misshapen head to bandy legs. She got the boy cleaned with 3 men helping her, and with others smiling about in their efforts to clean the room. She worked in silence and with a sense of outrage, annoyed by the continued strugglings and outcries of the boy and by the undignified drenching of soapy water to which she was subjected. Dr. Hoskins had hinted that the child would not be pretty, but that was far from stating that it would be repulsively deformed, and there was a stench about the boy with soap and water was only alleviating little by little. She had the strong desire to thrust the boy, soaped as he was, into Hoskins' arms and walk out, but there was a pride in the profession. She had accepted an assignment after all, and there would be the look in his eyes, a cold look that would read, "Only pretty children, Miss Fellows?" He was standing apart from them, watching coolly from a distance with half a smile on his face, when he caught her eye, as though amused at her outrage. She decided she would wait a while before quitting. To do so now would only demean her. Then, when the boy was a bearable pink and smelled of scented soap, she felt better anyway. His cries changed to whimpers of exhaustion as he watched carefully, eyes moving in quick frightened suspicion from one to another of those in the room. His cleanness accentuated his thin nakedness as he shivered with cold after his bath. Miss Fellows said sharply, "Bring me a nightgown for the child." A nightgown appeared at once. It was as though everything were ready, and yet nothing were ready unless she gave orders, as though they were deliberately leaving this in her charge without help to test her. The newsman, Devaney, approached and said, "I'll hold him, miss. You won't get it on yourself." "Thank you," said Miss Fellows, and it was a battle indeed. But the nightgown went on, and when the boy made as though to rip it off, she slapped his hand sharply. The boy reddened, but did not cry. He stared at her, and then splayed his fingers of one hand, moved slowly across the flannel of the nightgown, feeling the strangeness of it. Miss Fellows thought desperately, well, what next? Everyone seemed in suspended animation, waiting for her, even the ugly little boy. Miss Fellows said sharply, "Have you provided milk? Food?" They had. A mobile unit was wheeled in, with its refrigeration compartment containing 3 quarts of milk, with a warming unit, and a supply of fortifications in the form of vitamin drops, copper, cobalt, iron, syrup, and others she had no time to be concerned with. There was a variety of canned self-warming junior foods. She used milk, simply milk, to begin with. The radar unit heated the milk to a set temperature. In a matter of 10 seconds, it clicked off, and she put some in a saucer. She had a certainty about the boy's savagery. He wouldn't know how to handle a cup. Miss Fellows nodded and said to the boy, "Drink, drink." She made a gesture as though to raise the milk to her mouth. The boy's eyes followed, but he made no move. Suddenly the nurse resorted to direct measures. She seized the boy's upper arm in one hand and dipped the other in the milk. She dashed the milk across his lips so that it dripped down his cheeks and receding chin. For a moment the child uttered a high-pitched cry. Then his tongue moved over his wetted lips. Miss Fellows stepped back. The boy approached the saucer, bent towards it, then looked up, behind sharply as though expecting a crouching enemy, bent again and licked at the milk eagerly, like a cat. He made a slurping noise. He did not use his hands to lift the saucer. Miss Fellows allowed a bit of the revulsion she felt to show on her face. She couldn't help it. Devaney caught that, perhaps. He said, "Does the nurse know, Dr. Hoskins?" "Know what?" demanded Miss Fellows. Devaney hesitated, but Hoskins, again that look of detached amusement on his face, said, "Well, tell her." Devaney addressed Miss Fellows. "You may not suspect it, miss, but you happen to be the first civilized woman in history ever to be taking care of a Neanderthal youngster." She turned on Hoskins with a kind of controlled ferocity. "You might have told me, doctor. What's the difference? What difference does it make? You said a child. Isn't that a child? Have you ever had a puppy or a kitten, Miss Fellows? Are those closer to the human? If that were a baby chimpanzee, would you be repelled? You're a nurse, Miss Fellows. Your record places you in a maternity ward for 3 years. Have you ever refused to take care of a deformed infant?" Miss Fellows felt her case slipping away. She said with much less decision, "You might have told me, and you would have refused the position. Well, do you refuse it now?" He gazed at her coolly, while Devaney watched from the other side of the room, and the Neanderthal child, having finished the milk and licked the plate, looked up at her with a wet face and wide, longing eyes. The boy pointed to the milk and suddenly burst out into a short series of sounds repeated over and over, sounds made up of gutturals and elaborate tongue clickings. Miss Fellows said in surprise, "Why, he talks." "Of course," said Hoskins. "Homo neanderthalensis is not a truly separate species, but rather a subspecies of Homo sapiens. Why shouldn't he talk? He's probably asking for more milk." Automatically, Miss Fellows reached for the bottle of milk, but Hoskins seized her wrist. Now, Miss Fellows, before we go any further, are you staying on the job? Miss Fellows shook free in annoyance. Won't you feed 'em if I don't? I'll stay with 'em for a while. She poured the milk. Hoskins said, We're going to leave you with the boy, Miss Fellows. This is the only door to stasis number 1, and it is elaborately locked and guarded. I want you to learn the details of the lock, which will, of course, be keyed to your fingerprints, as they are already keyed to mine. The spaces overhead, he looked upward to the open ceilings of the dollhouse, are also guarded, and we will be warned if anything untoward takes place in here. Miss Fellows said indignantly, You mean I'll be under review? She thought suddenly of her own surveillance of the room interiors from the balcony. No, Hoskins said seriously. Your privacy will be respected completely. The view will consist of electronic symbolism only, which only a computer will deal with. Now you will stay with him tonight, Miss Fellows, and every night until further notice. You will be relieved during the day according to some schedule, and you will find convenient. We will allow you to arrange that. Miss Fellows looked about the dollhouse with a puzzled expression. But why all this, Dr. Hoskins? Hoskins, is the boy dangerous? It's a matter of energy, Miss Fellows. He must never be allowed to leave these rooms. Never. Not for an instant, not for any reason, not to save his life, not even to save your life. Miss Fellows, is that clear? Miss Fellows raised her chin. I understand the orders, Dr. Hoskins, and the nursing profession is accustomed to placing its duties ahead of self-preservation. Good. You can always signal if you need anyone. And the two men left. Miss Fellows turned to the boy. He was watching her, and there was still milk in the saucer. Laboriously, she tried to show him how to lift the saucer and place it to his lips. He resisted, but let her touch him without crying out. Always his frightened eyes were on her, watching for one false move. She found herself soothing him, trying to move her hands very slowly towards his, letting him see it every inch of the way. See, there was no harm in it. And she succeeded in stroking his hair for an instant. She said, I'm going to have to show you how to use the bathroom. Do you think you can learn? She spoke quietly, kindly, knowing he would not understand the words, but hoping he would respond to the calmness of the tone. The boy launched into a clicking phrase again. She said, May I take your hand? She held out hers, and the boy looked at it. She left it outstretched and waited. The boy's own hand crept forward towards hers. That's right, she said. It approached within an inch of hers, and then the boy's courage failed him. He snatched it back. Well, said Miss Fellows calmly, we'll try again later. Would you like to sit down here? She patted the mattress of the bed. The hours passed slowly, and progress was minute. She did not succeed either with the bathroom or with the bed. In fact, after the child had given unmistakable signs of sleepiness, he lay down on the bare ground, and then with a quick movement, rolled beneath the bed. She bent to look at him, and his eyes gleamed out at her as he tongue-clicked at her. All right, she said. If you feel safer there, you sleep there. She closed the door to the bedroom and retired to the cot that had been placed for her use in the largest room. At her insistence, a makeshift canopy had been stretched over it. She thought, those stupid men will have to place a mirror in this room, and a larger chest of drawers, and a separate washroom if they expect me to spend nights here. All right, let's finish with 3 questions. Everybody understand the very beginning?